Okay, so while we bring the slides up, I want to be clear. I have, on many times in my life, followed Linnell Latundra. When I was a young, relatively young captain, we were all in the Pentagon together. My wife was active duty. We were all working together. She was in our brain shop. I was about to be an executive officer. And we all had to go over, Linnell, me, Kate, the whole group, would have to go over to Bowling Air Force Base to do our PT tests. Now, this may or may not surprise you, but when we did the TT test, we'd start off at the same time, and with a matter of minutes, Linnell is like lapping me on the track, right? So I'm literally following her, and I would have been maybe a little bit embarrassed, and then my wife laps me on the track, and so I'm an athlete of the law, right? It's one of those things. So the other thing is up there, I'm associate dean at the National War College. And in case anybody's interested in how you become an associate dean at the National War College, you leave the room to get coffee and you come back and you're the associate dean at the National War College, the most burdensome cup of coffee I've ever had. Okay, so General Dunlap, he spends a ton of time planning this, and he asked what to brief on. What's a topic that you're working on a lot up at National War College? Just don't pick anything too controversial. And so I decided, let's see if I can get this to click here. Yeah, I decided to brief on the war in Gaza. And I will say that last night I got a slightly nervous phone call from my dear friend General Dunlap, poking around the edges. Adam, what are you going to hit on tomorrow? So here's how I want to caveat this. Right from the outset, right? So let's see if I can fly this thing. There we go. Okay, so first of all, I know this is redundant, right? I want to really foot stomp that these are just my views, okay? They're not the school's views, there's not the National Defense University views, et cetera, et cetera. What I am trying to do here over the course of the next half hour, 40 minutes, is give you some historical context about where the struggle came from, what's going on, a few early lessons from the war that's going on, and where we're headed, and try to do it from an American U.S. perspective. I've worked very closely with the Israelis in recent years. I have a number of students that were students of mine that are in the IDF as flag officers, but also some that are senior in the Emirati government in Egypt and whatnot. So I'm trying to draw on that, but I want to emphasize that this is my opinion and very much from a U.S. perspective in that regard. Okay, so let me start with a question. All these pictures, that's Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority there. What do all these pictures have in common? They have one thing in all of them. A key, right? We're going to come back to that, but that's going to be very, very important here. It's not something that we talk about in the U.S. a lot, but the symbolism of this key and understanding the ongoing struggle in the Middle East is really important and I think is really helpful. We're going to get back to that. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit of historical context and the source of the struggle. Who here's been to Jerusalem? One of the things that's really challenging is understanding the arguments that are made from the different sides about the historical claim to the territory of Israel-Palestine, right? The Israelis will argue that we go back, the Jewish heritage goes back to the recorded, we have documents, a document going back to about 1000 BC. Then, of course, we also sometimes forget that Christianity is built on Judaism, so Christianity incorporates, through the Old Testament, the Jewish tradition, the Jewish religion, and then Islam incorporates Judaism and Christianity as well, which is why when you make a historical argument or a historical claim to the region, it doesn't really carry a lot because of the way the religions build on each other. And for a long time, we thought that Jerusalem was the center of gravity and the main reason why the two sides have been able to come to some sort of agreement, right? The Israelis and the Palestinians. Anybody know the Arabic word or the Farsi word for Jerusalem? It's Quds, Al-Quds. So when you hear the Iranians talk about their elite unit as the Al-Quds force, they mean the Jerusalem force. Okay, that's where it's coming from. They have Al-Quds Day in Iran still, right? That's a national holiday there. The Quds Brigades are another one. But if you look at Jerusalem, the reason why it's so important is underneath the Dome of the Rock, there's a rock, right? And in that rock, on that rock, that is where, according to the Jewish tradition, the Garden of Eden was, and that's where Abraham offered to sacrifice Isaac, and that's where the first temple is built around 900 BC. Okay? Now, In the Roman times, the Jews built a temple roughly where where the rock is, where the dome is. That was the Great Temple. And until it was destroyed in 70 AD, that was the center of Jewish life, right? It had a priestly class. If you ever meet somebody with the last name of Cohen, they are most likely a descendant from that priestly class. But when the Romans destroy it in 70 AD, it completely changes the Jewish religion, which becomes a diasporatic religion, and the faith starts practicing their religion much more based on the rabbinical class, Talmud, and things like that. The only thing that is left of the Great Temple is the foundation wall, the western wall there, built by Herod, and it's holy to the Jews because of the fact that the temple was on top of it. On the top right-hand corner of that the top right-hand corner, that's the Garden of Gethsemane. That's where Christ appears in the Christian tradition, right? Before he's brought into the city. The walkway and the steps that he takes when he comes into Jerusalem and on the way to crucifixion is along where the top blue line is. There are two references in the New Testament to him being on the Temple Mount, and then he is crucified just off to the left here. It was outside the city walls at the time. It's now inside, but that's where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. So it's very important for Christians as well. For Muslims, the reason why it's so important and the third most holy site in Islam is because the Prophet Muhammad, when he's starting his ministry, travels to Jerusalem. The word Jerusalem doesn't appear in the Quran. It's called the Al-Aqsa Masjid, meaning the farthest mosque, Al-Masjid, right? That's where we get the name Al-Aqsa Mosque from, because this is where Muhammad goes. He ascends to heaven one night on what's called the night journey, and there he meets all the former prophets and receives the revelation from God about the prayer towards Mecca 5 times a day, and comes back and continues with his ministry. So for all of these three religions, this place is absolutely essential. You are going to see in the news in the coming week before Ramadan a debate going on in Israel about whether or not to limit the number of Muslims that can go up to the Dome of the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, which is the oldest mosque in Islam. Okay, there are people in the Israeli government that wants to limit it to kids under 10 and people over 60. The United States will doubtless oppose that, and we'll get into why they're doing that in a little bit as well. The point here is that if anybody wants to make, again, in my humble opinion, if anybody is trying to say that my historic claim to the land trumps yours, that's a very, very dangerous, hard argument to support. And I don't even know that it makes a difference, because neither of the sides that are involved in this are going to subscribe to that. Oh, you're right, you were here first, I guess we'll leave, right? That's not going to happen. It's kind of like my kids in the television. All right, so let's talk about the modern state of Israel and why what's going on now really does trace to its creation. Okay, so we're going to jump forward about 2,000 years. To understand Israel's creation and the dawn of the struggle that we have, you have to go back really to Russia in the 1900s. Okay, since the Spanish Inquisition, since the late 1400s, a lot of Jews had settled in this area in Eastern Europe called the Pale of Settlement, right? The Jews that lived there were murdered by the Nazis 80 years ago, but the largest concentration of Jews in the world was basically in where Ukraine is, Belarus is, Eastern Poland, et cetera, et cetera. The Tsar Alexander II, who was the progressive Tsar, kind of the enlightened leader, he's the one who frees the serfs, he treats the Jews well, he is then assassinated in 1881. Alexander III comes on, and he's a reactionary, and he tries to undo all of the progress that had made in Russia. He effectively does, and his scapegoat, his main target in Russia, becomes those Jews that are living in the Pale of Settlement. And so beginning in 1881, roughly the year he takes over, we have these pogroms. Pogrom is a word meaning to destroy, where thousands of Jews are killed. A lot of people in Israel referred to October 7th as a pogrom because of the way that it is. And you'll see a lot of the Jews here that are getting killed and being mistreated. And it's around this time that in this area, the Jewish population starts to say, we need to find another place. Okay, because we are not going to be able to survive here, and the rights that we did have been yanked from us. So the brutality of this period, right, captured in some art, et cetera, reflects what the Jews are enduring in Central Europe, Eastern Europe. Now, that alone probably would not have been enough to start what will become Zionism, the idea of moving to a Jewish homeland. But at the same time in Western Europe, which is supposed to be going through the height of or adopting Enlightenment principles, republicanism, et cetera, In France, we get the Dreyfus Affair, and you've probably seen the movie Papillon, things along those lines. All right, the Dreyfus Affair is important because it exposes to the Jews who thought that they had been fully integrated into French society that in fact they too, even in newly Republican France, can be subjected to abuse, used as scapegoats. There's rioting, anti-Semitism across France at the time. And so now you have in Western Europe also a movement, this idea that if Jews are going to survive, they need to have their own homeland. And around this time, you have an important leader by the name of Ted Herzl, Theodor Herzl. He's living in, they've got connections in Switzerland and in Eastern Europe, and he argues that the only way for Jews to be able to survive is to have their own country, Judenstaat, meaning the Jewish country, the Jewish state. Now, this is happening at a time when, what's the main movement, going back to, I don't know what AI would say, okay, but if you go back to the main movements that are going on in the late 1800s and early 1900s, what's the big movement that's going on in Europe at that time and in our own country? Nationalism, right? It's about this time that you start having German unification revolving around German language. You have French nationalism, Belgian nationalism, all of these things. To understand the birth of the modern state of Israel, you have to understand that this is another nationalist movement, right? That will eventually, in other parts of Europe, create independent states out of Austria-Hungary, etc. That's what his idea is. Now, when he writes this, he thinks of two places where Jews could move. One is to Argentina, and the other is to the Holy Land. And he is explicit to say that if we are going to move anywhere, we have to do it legally, right? We cannot just go and occupy the place, because if we do, we're going to be running into wars with the people that are there. There will be violence, et cetera, if we do that. But he also starts something called the Jewish Agency, the Jewish National Fund, and the goal is to start raising money so that perhaps the Jews at some point can, either in Argentina, there are other places that come up, start buying places so that they can flee the abuse that they are going through, mostly in Central Europe and also to a degree in Western Europe. What is the main formulating thing? If you're looking at nationalism, what does it tend to revolve around more than anything else? What tends to be the main unifying feature of nationalism? Language, right? This guy, Ben Yehuda, creates modern Hebrew. There was no Hebrew language widely spoken until the late 1800s, when modern Hebrew is deliberately invented for the purpose of having an organized language around which the new Jewish Zionist nationalism could exist. All right, there was Yiddish spoken, et cetera, but we have this language being made as well, okay? And so money starts to be built up. There are early Jews that will buy land in Palestine, et cetera, at least move there. But we're going to move from this because we can't really understand the rise of the struggle. Let me put one more thing on here. Before I get to the next slide, this is a guy by the name of Jabotinsky. We don't hear from him a lot, right? Understand that in the creation of Israel, what will eventually become Israel, there are two distinct strains of thought on how to do it. You have Ted Herzl's idea, Theodor Herzl, he probably doesn't care if I call him Ted, Theodor Herzl, right? So his idea is that we're going to do this peacefully, we're going to move to a country, what we talked about before. Jabotinsky, who is also from this area, from the Pale of Settlement, is much more militant, right? And today's Likud party, the Netanyahu party, right, traces its existence to Begin and then goes back to a lot of the extremist organizations in the 40s that go back to Jabotinsky. And their concept for a greater Israeli state, we didn't know Israel was going to be called Israel until it was announced as Israel in 1948. But this idea of a Jewish homeland, world Zionist, is that it would take basically all of the land that belonged to the first kingdom of Israel at approximately David's time and a little bit later. And you'll see that they wanted to include the valley on the other side of the Jordan River, the southern part of Lebanon, et cetera. And so when you look at the Israeli right today, the Israeli far right, which we're going to talk about, this is their claim. Okay, and so when you understand that, this goes back to the original discussion about what the territory of the state of Israel, when it's created, would eventually look like. Okay, let's switch. The other thing that's going on at this time is the Ottoman Empire, called the sick man of Europe, is starting to crumble. And as it is starting to crumble, they look to the West and they say, why are we losing all of our wars? Why is it that their education system is better? Why do we have turmoil? And why has our empire, which, not that long ago stretched roughly from Morocco to the Sind, it's being picked off in pieces by the colonial powers? And the decision that the Ottoman Turks make in the middle of the 1800s is they are going to modernize and they are going to become more like the West. They're going to build a Western army. They dispatch their mercenary army. They're going to have a Congress or a parliament. They have a constitution. They're going to do educational reforms. What does all this take? If you're going to build a new army, new schools, what do you need? Money, right? There is no concept in the Ottoman world of taxation in the Western sense. There's an idea of donations and zakat, et cetera, et cetera. So what the Ottomans do as part of their Tanzimat reforms is they start saying we need to do a property tax, a land tax. So for the first time, the Ottomans go out in the region, maybe ever, the Ottoman Turks who own this territory go out and they start looking at the land and saying, okay, who owns the land? Most of the people living on the land are peasant farmers, right? And there aren't that many people there. There was a large immigration into this area in the late 1900s coming out of famine, or the late 1800s coming out of famine in Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. But the people that own the land, that actually own the land, are city dwellers who live in Jerusalem, Damascus, Beirut, and Aleppo. They're not making anything off it. They just get the title because they're in the government. And then the Sultan comes along and says, okay, you got to pay your taxes. I'm not earning any money. What do I want? What do you do if you have property that you pay taxes on but isn't generating any revenue? Who's looking to buy? The Zionists, right? And so what you start getting in the late 1800s with these aliyah, these movements for the Jews, is they are coming down under the color of law, in accordance with Ottoman law, and they are buying territories in here. They are buying small parcels of land to grow food, right? And to set up this new Israeli Zionist movement, okay? Who's getting screwed in this deal? The peasants that work the land, that live there. The concept of land ownership is anathema, right, to them. Many of them grew olive trees. When the Jewish population comes down and they take the land, right, because they have bought it, they get rid of the olive trees because you can't live on olives. No matter how many martinis you drink, you can't live on olives, right? And so they are now made in a lot of different places homeless. And so the violence starts almost immediately. The Israelis will trace the first battle casualties in the war with the Palestinians to the 1860s when they go through their list of casualties of all time. And so this area the conflict starts pretty early on. The Ottomans will hold the territory more or less until the Ottoman Empire goes from the sick man of Europe and finally dies. Now, during World War I, there's the realization that the Ottoman Empire is going to completely collapse. The Brits, the French, and the Russians form a secret agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they agree to carve up the territory. The Russians drop out of the war, they leak the secret agreement, and the idea now, and it makes Wilson really mad, this whole thing, we're fighting for democracy and self-determination, and the Brits and the French are like, whatever you say, right? They're not. They come up with this idea called mandates, where they are going to take over the land, right? And they will govern the land until these states are capable of governing themselves. But in Palestine, they take no steps to set up that kind of government. So this is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And when we look at it, it's eventually in the San Remo Conference in 1920, it's turned into law, and they carve this territory up. And there's this famous story where the Brits go to the French at San Remo and say, you know what? We know that you're supposed to have this area out here at the top of those rivers, but we found oil there, and we would like to have this area around Mosul. And the French say, and you shall have it. And so literally at a conference table over donuts and coffee, this part of Iraq is grafted onto this new country of Iraq, meaning that Iraq is now split between who? Kurds, Shiites, and Sunni, right? Shiites in the south, Sunni in the middle, Kurds in the north. And that's worked out really, really well, okay? Here's another one, Lebanon. The French have always thought of themselves since Crusader times as being the protectors of the sites in Lebanon, right? And so they want to get Lebanon, but they decide, like all colonial rulers, we want to have a minority party that we will support and defend. They will be given security in exchange for them giving us what? Resources, oil, tobacco, and whatever it is. And then you have that small group in there that depends on you for security over the larger group. It's the colonial model, and it typically will lead to exploitation. But in order to balance it the way that they wanted to, they took a slice of what was going to be Syria and they move it and graft it onto Lebanon, so that Lebanon is now mixed up between a number of Shia, Sunni, Maronite Christians, Druze, et cetera, et cetera. And that's worked out really, really well. Okay? So understand, this is all maps that are being done. And when Lebanon becomes a state, there's a rule that says, okay, the majority party will be the president. Right now, it's the Maronite Christians, so they will run the country, and they haven't had a census since 1946, because if they had one, the head of state would now almost certainly become a Shiite Muslim, right? A Shiite Lebanese. And then, of course, there's the big one that we're talking about here. The British take over the mandate. And to understand the British mandate from the beginning, it is critical to understand that they promised it to everybody, right? In a series of letters called the Hussein McMahon office, or letters, the guy who's in charge of Saudi Arabia, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Remember, Prophet Muhammad, right, he's from a family called, what? The Hashim, the Banu Hashim, right? That's his last name, the Hashemites. The Brits put a Hashemite on the throne of Jordan, not because he's from Jordan, but because he's a direct descendant of Prophet Muhammad, and it's going to give him legitimacy, right? So that's why we the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. The Brits also, in the Balfour Declaration in 1917, agreed to establish a Jewish homeland there too. So the Arabs think, going out of World War I, that they're going to have one large Arab superstate. The Jews think that they're going to have their own state, and the Brits don't intend on giving it up at all. So what we end up with, oh, by the way, I'd like to point this out. This is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Has anybody seen this before? That's the hashtag that ISIS used when it came across the berm from Syria into Iraq in 2014. Sykes-Picot, we never talk about it. The population over there knows darn well what happened during this period. And this is the announcement of the ISIS invasion of Iraq, is with that hashtag. All right. So what did the British get? They take over, right? This is the Palestine Mandate. This is the area that they control. They send troops in. Starting in 1936, there's an Arab revolt. The Arabs are revolting against having the Jews moving in. The Brits send a commission down in 1937. How are we going to get out of here? And there's something called the Peel Commission. And the Peel Commission says, look, the only way you guys are going to, or we're going to be able to get out, is to divide it into two parts. This is the idea of the two-state solution. It goes back to the late 1930s. And the Peel Commission is the basis for what they come up with. The UN decides to create a state of Israel in 1947 and 1948. The yellow areas were going to be Palestine, were going to be Israel. The black areas are supposed to be the Palestinian state. They weren't using the term Palestine yet, but that was going to be the Arab state. The Arab world rejects this. The local population rejects this. The Israelis will say typically that they rejected this because they wanted to have it all. They wanted to take it over. That's true. But back then, the goal was to create an Arab superstate. None of these dividing lines that the colonial powers had made up largely for purposes of extrapolating deals. It was called, let's say exploitation. We'll use that word. That was the goal, right? So when Israel declares that it's going to be a state, or before that even, all the Arab armies invade. Now, the Arabs will tell you, if you start looking at this land, the richest land in Palestine, Israel, is that yellow area north and south of Tel Aviv. Why? Because it's on the coast, and there are mountains on the other side of the coast, and that's the richest farmland that there is. Okay, so the rich territory, at least in there, would have gone to the Israelis. On the same thing on the northeast section there as well. That's the argument that they will make now too. But the main thing is, for the Arab position, was that they thought that they had been promised the whole thing. They did have the documents to show it. And so the conflict begins. Now, in 1948, the Arabs will fight the Israelis. The Israelis defeat 5 Arab armies. 1% of the Israeli population is killed. But this is where the borders end up after the 1948 war, okay? The yellow, where the yellow meets the black and where the yellow meets the gray, those are the borders of Israel between 1948 and 1967, and that is called the Green Line. Literally, because when the peace or the ceasefire was done, a guy with a green magic marker, you can go see the map, they actually used a green pen to divide where the line was going to be. That is the pre-67 borders. So a lot of the discussion when you hear about the Green Line is they're talking about the territory Israel had before 1967, right? And then in 1967, they capture the Golan, the West Bank. the Gaza Strip. They'll give the Sinai back to Egypt in 1979 in exchange for peace. They leave Gaza in 2005, right, to rule itself, but they also basically, with the Egyptians, keep an embargo, a blockade on Gaza. And then in 2006, Gaza is taken over in fair, free elections by a terrorist organization called Hamas. So we'll talk about that here. All right. This is a map that the Palestinians use all the time, right? They will say, and they will argue that this area in green was all Palestinian, and then it shrinks, and then you have today. That's what's called Area A in the West Bank in Gaza, right? The Israelis will turn around and say this was never Palestinian land. There was no Palestine. This was Ottoman territory, right, where both Jews and Palestinians lived, and so goes the argument on and on and on. From an American perspective, though, right, know that this is what the argument is about from the Palestinian side and the shrinking that's going on, all right? And the Israelis have their counter maps, which I don't put up there, but know that that's the other side of it as well. And this is al-Nakba, which is what the Palestinians refer to 47 and then 48 when the state of Israel. It means disaster in Arabic. It was originally used as a term meaning the Arab abandonment of the Palestinian people, and then starting about 30 years ago, it's changed to mean basically the Arab or the expulsion and departure of Palestinians from inside the Green Line. Okay. This is a map, right? This is pretty new. A lot of these that I'm going to put up are pretty recent. The thing to remember about the West Bank, which is still under Israeli occupation, right? That was the area that had not been conquered by the Israelis or captured in 48. It's divided into 3 different parcels. The dark blue area is Area A. That's run by the Palestinian Authority, right? Not Hamas, but the other ruling Palestinian entity in this area is the Palestinian Authority. It answers to the Palestine Liberation Organization, sometimes called Fatah. The blue areas are governed by the Palestinians. The light blue areas, shared governance, and everything else, 60%, is controlled by the Israelis. The Palestinians will point out that since 1993, when this happened, this was originally supposed to become the Palestinian state along with Gaza, that to this day, you cannot move between the blue areas without going through Israeli permission, right? There's a very good comedian who talks about her experience growing up there, and somebody asks, how many languages do you speak? And she will say, well, I speak French, Arabic, English, and checkpoint Hebrew, right? Understand there are a lot of reasons why this never developed into its own state. The best argument I've heard is that you've got far-right members in Israel from that Jabotinsky line who never wanted a Palestinian state there, and there are a couple of them still in the Israeli government, all right? And then you have the Palestinians, far right of the Palestinians, who were terrorist organizations that launched attack after attack in Israel, right, in order to really drive more support to the Israeli far right, because the last thing either side wants is a peace with some sort of compromise. Okay? So let's talk about the causes and constraints of the war. Let's get back to the keys. When the Palestinians left, right, and there are a lot of reasons why they left in 47 and 48. Okay, the Palestinian narrative is that there was a massacre by Israeli far-right organization at a town called Deir Yassin, and once that happened, word got out, and so the Palestinians, about 750,000 of them, flee, and then another several hundred thousand also leave in 1967, although not as many, right? And these are refugees, these 750,000 people, they leave. We also know that the Egyptians and the Jordanians were broadcasting on the radio, get out, leave, as soon as we take the territory back, we will put you back in, and some of them left for that reason. But a lot of the Palestinians, when they left, those 750,000, left with what? They left with their keys to the houses that they used to own. And the key becomes the symbol of what's called the right of return. The idea is that any peace agreement that the Israelis and the Palestinians have must have the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Okay, I think Don Zolde would say, pick up your pen, right? Right of return of Palestinian refugees, okay, has to be part of a peace settlement. The challenge is, though, that because there had been no refugee organization created in 49 yet, it's not created until 51, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, They come up with this ad hoc program called the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. And they make the very controversial decision that unlike any other refugees in the world since then, that the status of being a refugee passes to your children and your grandchildren and their children, to the point now that instead of 750,000 refugees, you have upwards of 6 to 7 million registered. So every time that there's been an attempt at peace, 79, 93, 2000, 2001, the thing that breaks down the peace agreement is not the question of Jerusalem. It's not the question of borders. It is this question of the right of return. And why does it matter? There's even a museum in Damascus about this. It's why you see it on those on those pictures I put at the beginning of this. Why? Okay, so if you have time, this book is written by Micah Goodman. Right, he's a Talmudic scholar. He wrote this book a couple years ago before the war, but it's the best layout from an Israeli perspective about the problem with the right of return. The population of Israel, about 8 or 9 million, 25% of whom are already Arabs. Right, so 25% of the Israeli population is Arab. He points out, right, that if you bring in all of these refugees, especially if they are childbearing age, leave out the 6 million of them, just 700,000 or 500,000 of them or 400,000 of them, that in a matter of a decade, the Arab population will now outnumber the Jewish population in what is supposed to be what? The Jewish state. And so Catch 67, what he's talking about, and this is really important to understand, is the Israelis are trapped in the sense that they can do one of two things. They can either allow the Palestinians in and give everybody the vote, right, as you would in a normal liberal democracy, so that Israel can maintain that flavor of being a liberal democracy, which it is, okay? It's the only liberal democracy in that region. It has its problems, so do we, right? But they're working through them. So are we. Anyway, this isn't about us. As you look at this, right, and what he's arguing is they can do that, and then they will democratically vote out the Jewish control of the Jewish state. And the Jewish state exists so that the Jews have a refuge, a place where they can go, right? Because for 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, which spreads like a virus, unless they have a home, they're killed. The other alternative is, of course, what? They can bring in those people, but make them second-class citizens. Israel's not, people will say Israel's an apartheid state. That's a different debate, okay? But you bring in 700,000 or 500,000 Palestinians and say, but you can't vote, right? Now you're getting pretty close to an apartheid state. So they can't really be a democracy. So for the Israelis, the right of return is and always has been an existential threat to the survival of Israel as a Jewish liberal democracy. And that is why Arafat walked away from the best peace deal. Look, in 2000, Arafat was offered to have the Jewish quarter in East Jerusalem, to have the top of the Temple Mount, to be able to return, I think it was 10,000 people, that the West Bank and Gaza would become a state under his leadership. The Israelis would build a highway between the two. They would have an airport, a foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. And he walked away because he would not yield on this question of the right of return. BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction, right? A very effective information campaign led by, there's a lot of debate over who funds it, right? But what's their argument? This idea of refugees' right of return is central to it. Now, how, before October 7th, this was a very effective use of the informational campaign, of the informational instrument of power, right? The idea was that if we can get enough people to boycott, divest, and sanction the Israelis through economic pressure on the Israelis as their economy collapses, et cetera, we can force them to the table and get them to start talking about a peace agreement, and eventually the return of not just the refugees from 1948, but because of UNRWA, anybody that claims refugee status. Bella Hadid, if she wants to, can claim that she is a Palestinian refugee, right, because of the way that the laws were working. And the Israelis will argue that UNRWA has been the main reason, the main perpetuation of the struggle, because it keeps out this false hope for the Palestinians about the right of return. Now, I want to point something else about the right of return. If your grandfather was kicked out of Palestine in 1948 at the point of a bayonet, and you are the third generation living in a refugee camp in Jordan where you do not have citizenship, right? Because the Arab countries aren't giving citizenship to the Palestinians. Your family is spread around the world, but you know that the standard of living in Israel is 10 times what it is where you live in Jordan, right? And you have no social mobility in the country you're in, and the schools are better, et cetera, et cetera. This idea of return has a very personal, right? There's no interest like self-interest. And so that starts to drive it as well and complicates it. Okay, let's talk about the war here. Remember, there's two organizations. This is the PLO, or the Palestine Authority, the PA, created in 1993. Israel recognizes the PA as the legitimate government of the Palestinians. The PLA, or the PA, Palestinian Authority, recognizes the Israelis, but there's still this issue of a peace agreement. The position of the PA on the right of return, the most recent thing they've said is, we mean in the West Bank and Gaza when it's our own state, okay, but not clear. Hamas is something totally different, and this is what I want to talk about. Hamas means strength. It's basically an acronym. Arabic's beautiful, and so many words in there have double meanings, et cetera, and it's an acronym, and when you put it together, it means strength. There's also a Hebrew interpretation, which I think means hate. I mean, it's interesting. So it's created in 1988 during the midst of the first Intifada that's going on, and it has its own command structure completely independent of the PA. The leader of Hamas is in Qatar. The military leader is this guy called Yahya Sinwar, and then this guy named Deif. He's really the military commander in Gaza right now. The Israelis call him the cat of 9 lives because they keep trying to kill him, and they've been unable to. In 1996, he bombed a bus that killed 46 people. He was arrested. He escaped. The Israelis tried to kill him. They killed his wife. They killed 2 of his 4 kids in the process, and he's in hiding, and he's somewhere over there as well. But this is the main militant organization that's leading the war against Israel, and that was completely on their own, probably behind the October 7th attack on Israel, on the Simchat Torah attack. Sinwar was arrested by the Israelis because he had killed 4 or 5 people that were informers. They were Palestinians that were supposedly informing on the Israelis. He strangled 3 or 4 of them to death with his own bare hands, another one accidentally, et cetera, et cetera. He's in an Israeli prison, and a number of years ago, in order to get one captured Israeli back, they released 1,600 prisoners, and he's one of them, after they'd also treated him for cancer and cured him while he was in prison. Okay? To understand the war, though, we have to understand the ideology. Is Hamas ISIS? I don't know. But I can tell you that emphatically that their narrative and the end state they are searching for are very, very similar. Okay? What are they looking for? They are looking in the long run to replace the Western liberal international rules-based order with a model based on pure Islamic medieval jurisprudence, and that is what they are trying to do. Remember, most of global struggle right now between us and the Russians, us and the Chinese, a lot of it is a question about who's going to replace the order, and this is the order that they are seeking. Hamas, this is another piece here, if you have a chance, if you read Graham Wood's piece, this is the most important piece to come out in 2015 about what ISIS wants, and the piece I had on there before by Bruce Hoffman. He is probably the top terrorist scholar in the US right now, and he goes through it. So as we look at it, this is in the Hamas charter. Complete destruction of Israel is an essential condition for liberation. Unrestrained and unceasing holy war. In other words, we're not going to follow the Western rules of war. Anybody that tries to make peace with the Israelis is an apostate, the punishment for which is death. And then it's deeply rooted in conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic tropes. The political mastermind behind the narrative that Hamas has is this guy. This is the Grand Mufti al-Husseini. He was the ranking Palestinian he's one of the first people to call for a Palestinian state, but during World War II, he made the decision to align with the Nazis. He spent the war in Germany. This is him meeting with Adolf Hitler. We have all the correspondence where he's asking Hitler to come in and annihilate the Jews in Palestine. They were already annihilating the Jews in areas that they occupied in North Africa, Algeria, etc. Hitler never says that he's going to do it, but says once we break through the Caucasus, we'll come in down from the south. al-Husseini is going to be tried as a war criminal in the former Yugoslavia because he had built an entire Muslim SS division out of the Bosnians. So a lot of what you see in the narrative of Hamas comes from writings that he had done, which is beyond any doubt rooted in the Nazi agenda and the Nazi ideology and the Nazi lessons of the time, right? So this is the leader, the thought leader for Hamas, certainly the militant wing. Okay, let's talk about the war, some of the lessons we've learned so far. This is the latest map where you'll see where the Israelis are. I've talked to the Israelis a fair amount. The red dash line, that's as far as the attack squads, the terrorists got. You can see down here, Hatzarim Air Base, they were probably trying to get that far when the Israelis were able to stop them. This whole yellow area completely evacuated, and this is the movement of the IDF into Gaza so far. The big question down here in Rafah is whether or not they're going to go in there. I've been to Gaza. I've been from the top to the bottom of Gaza. It's a long time ago. A lot of what we see in the press, the Israelis will put pictures up of this beautiful beach community. The Palestinians will put put pictures up of before the war of horrid conditions. The fact is that there was both of there in Gaza before the war, but Hamas was living in the really rich areas, and the population, the 1.2 million people there, were living lower than that, down to the conditions of squalor. The Israelis will say these are the number of Israelis that have been killed in wars. The blues, the number of civilians that have been killed. The reason Bibi is so popular with Israelis that were alive and young in the early 1990s, that's Netanyahu, is because of these numbers here, that he stopped the attacks. That's October 7th standing by itself, right? That's the equivalent of 50,000 Americans being killed in one day by the attacks. I've seen the movie. It is unspeakable what happened, and to understand Israel's perspective on it, to understand what they went through, it's helpful it's important to consider this as well. But it's also, as a strategist, important to realize that if we think there's an appetite in Israel for a ceasefire or something along those lines, there just isn't. Not right now. The Palestinian numbers, right? A lot of these numbers that we get are coming from Hamas and from the Palestinians. They may be high. Okay, so maybe they're high by a third. That's still 18,000 dead civilians and 5,000 dead children. We don't know if these numbers are accurate or not, but there are agencies in there, and we do know that the devastation has been absolutely horrible, right? This is a picture after the rescue, or after the October 7th attack, right? The Israelis had to go from car to car to try and pull bodies out. We know that the Palestinian terrorists or the Hamas guys had burned. It's been absolutely horrible for them, right? The character of this war, we know that it's globalized, right? Armor, space, and air power combined is what has allowed the Israelis to dominate it. Now we would add on special forces units are incredibly important. The international organizations so far have been delegitimized across the board, and Hamas is using a very effective vanguard strategy, meaning we're the elite. If some people have to die above us, that's okay because of the utilitarian ultimate goal of a just world under Islamist caliphal rule, okay, in a nutshell. This is an interesting piece here. The Modern War Institute at West Point is doing incredible stuff on this. Meanwhile, the Israelis, just in the time I have, a couple things to think about. This is the Israelis' top lawyer. The MAG, the Israeli Judge Advocate General, they are doing amazing work, right, in trying to make sure that war crimes are prosecuted. And they're under political pressure just as they are here, right? I mean, Cali got, the guy who committed the My Lai massacre, commuted, right? It's the same politics are going on there, but they are doing a very, very robust prosecution of war crimes that are going on, in part because they don't want their folks standing in front of the International Criminal Court, but also in part because it's imbued in the Israeli army, and it has been since 1948. So those are worth, from a legal perspective, law of war's perspective as well. The Israelis are taking precautions, right? This goes back to 2014, and this is how the Israelis see it. And that's their narrative. All right, what's next? I'll wrap up here. Things to watch. This is Lebanon. That yellow area is supposed to be a demilitarized zone. The area between those blue dashed lines, That has been evacuated. There are between 60, 70, some would say as many as 90,000 internally displaced Israelis right now. And the Israelis are not going to politically give into something or come up with an agreement that makes it risky for the Israelis to move back into those border communities. Watch what happens there. We've been watching it all along. Do we think that it's going to blow up into a war? No, because it's not really in anybody's interest. The Hezbollah folks really don't want it. The Iranians don't want it. But when the amount of fires are going back and forth, the potential for mass escalation is really, really big. And the Israelis will also tell you that there's fear about Netanyahu, because when this war is over, Netanyahu is almost certainly going to lose his government and is likely to end up in the dock for things that he had done before the war. So there's a fear that it's not in his personal interest for this thing to end anytime soon. The pressure of the hostages, enormous. It has absolutely worked for Hamas in terms of restricting the Israeli application of fires, right? Because there are over 120 hostages there. Where does this leave Israel? They can't agree to a ceasefire because that leaves Hamas on their borders. They need to take out Hamas, right, for their own sake. Otherwise, they're going to have an eliminationist Nazi equivalent organization on their border. But at the same time, they are doing a horrible job of planning for the day after. Bibi announces his plan yesterday. It's military occupation of Gaza indefinitely. That's what it comes down to, reoccupation. And remember, he's got people on the right, like this guy, Ben-Gvir, who likes the map I showed you from 1919 about what Greater Israel, for religious reasons, is supposed to look like. This guy is in the Israeli cabinet, and he was so far right and so racist that the IDF refused to bring him in under conscription. If you're so racist that the IDF won't let you come in because of the draft, it's probably you, right? So this guy here, right, is one of the two people in Bibi's cabinet that if he leaves, Netanyahu's government collapses and a new government comes in. So he keeps throwing stuff to this guy to keep him in the government. And the latest thing that he's throwing this guy is saying, yeah, maybe we won't let people go up on the Temple Mount for Ramadan unless they're elderly or young children, okay? Questions, are the Palestinians trapped? It's a horrible condition. It is a horrible situation from them. And part of the problem is nobody is standing up for them. You can't have a peace, right? You can't be, the old saying, you are either at the peace table as a party to the peace conference or you are on the menu, right? And who's going to represent the Palestinians? The Palestinian Authority has minimal legitimacy, right, because they cooperate with the Israelis so closely. That's the government in the West Bank. The polling that's out right now is that the vast majority of Palestinians are aligned with Hamas. They weren't before the war, but they are now. They think that it's all propaganda and AI generated. On the other hand, if you're enduring that amount of bombing and bombing and bombing, it usually doesn't have the effect of making you closer to the people that are bombing you or the people that are aligned with them, right? And the Israelis will tell you that it's all about Iran, right? There is no solid evidence yet to show that Iran told Hamas to do this or that Iran is behind it. Did the Iranians know about it? We don't even really know that. So far, the Israelis have found some Iranian cash in one safe. They do believe that they say it's the head of the octopus over and over and over again, right? But we don't really know. What we do know is that there are really two countries in the world that are calling for the annihilation of another country in their entirety. The Iranians calling for the annihilation of Israel and the Russians calling for the annihilation of Ukraine, right? And so the Israelis are scared to death of what's happening here. And then the question is what happens when the Iranians get a nuke, which is, again, my opinion, unavoidable at this point. A few things else to watch. Look what's going on in Europe. The protests, the riots, et cetera, are pushing European governments to the right. That's not in our interest. One would argue to have illiberal governments popping up, but that's starting to happen. This guy's very, very far right, may be able to form a government in the Netherlands. Watch what's going on in the BBC. London they had a crisis in Parliament. The MPs that were pro-Israel felt physically threatened and that they weren't being protected. So that's an issue that's going on in Europe as well to see what's going to happen. And then, of course, there's our election, which is somebody else's job to talk about, but this is real, right? This is Ramat Trump. It's a town where you can buy a house that's been graded up on the Golan Heights. Remember, the Israelis captured the Golan Heights in 1967, annexed them in 1981. It's illegal. It's a flagrant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. You cannot annex conquered territory. And in 2018, the Trump administration recognized the Golan Heights as being part of Israel, and now there's Ramat Trump, right, where you too can live, okay? The problem is, though, militarily, strategically, the Israelis can't possibly give up the Golan Heights because of their whoever owns the Golan Heights dominates what's on the other side with artillery and information, okay? And then, of course, we have the issue in this country about what's going to happen, and is this going to shape our election, and who gets elected, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the thing to end on, right, is we have to recognize what U.S. interests are here and recognize that there's a good possibility that our interests diverge from the Israelis' perception of their interests. American interest is stability in that region. American interest is that we don't get dragged into a war there. The first great lesson, who's read Thucydides? Sir, I know you were assigned Thucydides, so it's, right? So the first lesson that Thucydides has is that great powers don't go to war with each other. They get dragged in by their smaller allies, right? That's why George Washington said, stay out of Europe. That's why we didn't do any of this stuff until 1945 when we thought it was in our interest and probably was to end the isolation peace, right? But for there to be stability in the region, there has to be a two-state solution. There's no solution through ethnic cleansing. There's no solution through the perpetuation of a constant frozen war, because eventually somebody's going to introduce WMD into the mix, right? But for the Israelis politically right now, domestically, and even, there is no appetite for a two-state solution because of what happened on October 7th. And if that was Hamas's intent, damn it, they did it, right? And it's going to take leadership, and it's also going to take representation for the Palestinians, and we don't know who that's going to be yet, right? For the Israelis, it's all about security. For us, it's about, yeah, their security is important, but for us, it's about stability, right? You'll have another class on this, whatever. Is it the same thing in Ukraine, right? Do the Ukrainians want to retake their land, right? Maybe, but what's in our interest? Stability. So hopefully we'll get there. Here are the books, and then finished on time. I'll make sure you guys get these, and then on time. There we go. All right, sir.
Adam, that was just a spectacular presentation. I learned a lot and very even-handed. This is a sensitive issue. You did it the right way, and I'm super, super happy. The bad news is that we don't have any time for questions. The good news is that Adam's going to be around afterwards. And so we're going to make a little, flexibility is the key to air power. So we're going to take our break now. We are going to take 10 minutes, and we'll come back at 10:30 and start our space panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.